I'm not as think as I smart I am. I'm not as think as I smart I am. I'm not as think as I thought I might be, for that's clear anybody to see. I'm not as think as I smart I am.
Welcome to the BrainsMatter podcast. This is episode 7 for the 28th of November 2006. I'm the Ordinary Guy, and I'll bring you stories on science, curiosities, general knowledge, and anything else that's interesting. There's been a bit of feedback this week. Andrew from Mount Eliza in Australia writes, I listened to all the episodes yesterday morning on my MP3 player and they sounded great, but could really hear it starting to come together after about the third episode. Well, I'm glad to hear that, Andrew. I was hoping that it would improve as time went on, and thanks for your suggestions on recording equipment for interviews. Andrew continued to write, As for the show itself, I'm seriously impressed. You gave me a whole bunch of things to think about today, for example, global dimming, which I'd heard about but not really thought about. Well, I'm glad it made you think, Andrew. That's what a show like this is all about. It presents you with stories, and if it makes you think or wonder about the world enough to make you go out and learn more, then it's doing its job. For those who don't know what Vedic culture is, it's the ancient Indian culture which originated in northern India and gave rise to what's currently known as the Hindu religion around 5,000 or so years ago. It's been known for a while that the Vedic culture and religion has had a high scientific content, and considering a lot of the knowledge is thousands of years old, it's quite astonishing when we think about what we've learned, or perhaps relearned, in the last few hundred years. Did you know that Vedic literature talked about flying machines, which they call vimanas? Perhaps these were the foresight to current-day aeroplanes. The description in the Mahabharata states that there were 2-story celestial chariots with many windows. They roar off into the sky until they appear like comets. Sounds a lot like a modern jet engine airplane, doesn't it? The Rig Veda, which is the oldest document known to the human race, describes a craft called a Sundara Vimana. The design of the Sundara Vimana resembles a rocket, and the description in the Vedas state that smoke and vapour surcharged with water turn into cloud. Think of the oxygen and hydrogen tanks used on modern space shuttles. Does this sound familiar? The texts of the Rig Veda from the 1st to the 10th mandal also mention Vimanas, which have a triangular kind of shape and are around 9 foot by 9 foot, so around 81 square feet, and are capable of accommodating 7 or 8 people. The delta wing configuration is quite common in modern day stealth aircraft as well. Parts of the Vedas even talk about other planets. Contrast this to the European view that the Earth was the centre of the universe until the 1600s or so. Those who have studied the subcontinent may be familiar with the Aryan invasion theory, which basically said that Aryans came from outside India rather than being natives of the Indus Valley region, which is the currently accepted view. But the invasion theory doesn't really hold water when one considers that all this ancient science, as described in the various Vedic religious texts, didn't appear anywhere in Europe during the same timescale. It was thousands of years later before Europe rediscovered this level of knowledge. The Vimanas also give a description of the concept of propulsion, which is used in rockets and jets today. Former Italian NATO officer Dr. Roberto Pinotti, who is, of all things, an expert in UFOs, describes the designs of the Shakuna Vimana as a cross between a plane and a rocket of our times. There's a document called the Samarangana Sutradhara which, after having been translated from Sanskrit to English, revealed a scientific treatise which talks about dealing with air travel in every possible fashion in a Vimana. Not restricting ourselves to rockets and planes, the Mahabharata also has a passage in it which says, and I quote, "The weapon was a single projectile charged with all the power of the universe, an incandescent column of smoke and flame as bright as 1,000 suns rose in all its splendour. An iron thunderbolt, a gigantic messenger of death, which reduced to ashes the entire race of the Vrishis and the Andakas. The corpses were so burnt as to be unrecognisable. The hair and nails fell out, pottery broke without apparent cause, and the birds turned white. After a few hours all the foodstuffs were infected. To escape from this fire, the soldiers threw themselves in streams to wash themselves and their equipment." This sounds very much like the description of an atomic war, doesn't it? There are many, many more references to things in Vedic and Hindu texts, from elements to planets, even to Pythagoras' theorem. Maybe what we learn as scientific theory today was already known to those in the ancient world. Now, isn't that interesting? And now it's time for today's brain teaser. Who is credited with inventing the telephone? I'll give you the answer to the brain teaser later in the show. So what makes us who we are? We all have arms, legs, and so on. Inside each of these we have muscles and organs, and inside the organs we have fibres and cells. And if we go right down to the microscopic level, we start looking at protein sequences called deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA. This is a double-stranded helical molecule found in the nucleus of each cell. DNA also carries genetic information that allows cells to reproduce and perform their functions. The molecule is held together by chemical components called bases. These bases are paired off, and they are adenine, or A, and that only bonds with thymine, T. Cytosine, or C, bonds with guanine, known as G, and I probably pronounced that wrong. These are also known as the secret code of life. Scientists at the Joint Genome Institute in California in the USA have reconstructed a section of DNA from the genome of Neanderthal man, an evolutionary relative of modern man, or Homo sapiens, and lived around 38,000 years ago. The hope is that by reconstructing this DNA, scientists can then find out details such as what colour hair, eyes, and skin the Neanderthal man had, and whether they had the capacity for language, and how they contributed to the modern gene pool. The letters I mentioned earlier, the A, T, C, and G, they form base pairs, and in the Neanderthal genome there are around 3.2 billion base pairs. Svante Pääbo of the Max Planck Institute in Germany used a different method to the US team and managed to sequence 1 million base pairs as opposed to the 65,000 of the US team. Professor Parbo is studying the gene that is related to the development of language, and then comparing this information to the skills of chimpanzees and modern humans. Both teams are in agreement with their results, and the evidence points to a divergence in the human evolutionary path around 500,000 years ago. This confirms mitochondrial DNA data and archaeological data. Neanderthals shared 99.95% of their DNA sequences with modern humans. This compares to around 98% similarity between humans and chimpanzees, who split from a common ancestor around 6 or 7 million years ago.
Then you realize the future is now arrived, and it's the best vacuum test designed and not divine to meet the spec, building houses on the moon. We'll make lots of money. Too many houses built too soon. I believe in this planetary scary blue.
Now it's time for the answer to today's brain teaser. So who is credited with inventing the telephone? If you answered Alexander Graham Bell, you're actually wrong. Alexander Graham Bell is now thought to have stolen some of the ideas from an Italian inventor named Antonio Meucci. Despite being the first to patent the telephone, it's now universally recognized that he didn't, in fact, invent it. Back in June 2002, the American Congress officially recognized Meucci as the true inventor of the telephone. In 1860, 16 years before Bell took out his patent, Meucci invented a device called the tetraphono and demonstrated it in New York. Bell had access to Meucci's materials, and the rest, well, we all know the story from that point onwards, don't we?
Houses on the moon. Too many houses built too soon. I believe in this planetary scary blue. I'm ready to board a rocket for some moonshine city.
So what's been happening in the world of knowledge lately? Well, Newsfactor reports that, in the US at least, that the internet has become second only to television as the primary source of science news. I guess that means it's the secondary source of science news. But nevertheless, the prevalence of science information and websites has encouraged users to turn to the web in their quest for knowledge. I just hope that brainsmatter is doing its part for you. Reuters News reports that American researchers have discovered that the humpback whale have a type of brain cell that up until now has only been seen in humans, the great apes, and dolphins. This indicates that humpback whales may be far more intelligent than originally thought, and that brains may have had a multi-evolutionary path. There's a type of cell called a spindle neuron in the cortex, which is very similar to the same type of cell found in humans and the great apes. They've also found that whales have very complex communication patterns and social behaviour, which is reminiscent of the way humans behave. So the linkages in evolutionary paths has the biologists very excited.
Recognize the faces traveling, miracle with sight.
Have you ever been in a large space and had to address an audience of several hundred, or a few thousand, and the microphone and speakers haven't worked properly? It becomes a difficult task, doesn't it? Well, if you lived in Mayan civilization, this might not have been a problem. A presentation at the upcoming Acoustical Society of America and the Acoustical Society of Japan by David Lubman will report that the Mayans seem to have understood acoustics within their building architectures extremely well. An example of this is a 1,100-year-old great ball court at Chichen Itza in Mexico, whereby sections called whispering galleries allowed visitors to hear whispers over 450 feet away. It's believed that this would allow priests or musicians to be heard to a crowd of up to 3,000 people outside. Imagine how much power this would save if modern rock concerts used this ancient technology.
Photographs. All the stripes he has are infected with forgotten shame. He wishes film would make him fade among the stars.
Thank you once again for listening to the BrainsMatter podcast for the 28th of November 2006. If you've got any comments, questions or suggestions, please drop me an email at mail@brainsmatter.com or leave a comment on the website at www.brainsmatter.com. You can find all the older podcasts there on the site. And let me know how you found the podcast. There's now a Frapper map link on the right hand side of the website in the blog roll section. Just click on that and put in a pin to show where you live. I'm curious to see where all of you are listening from. Thank you to everyone who's already put a pin into the Frapper map, and don't fret if you think the map doesn't show your location. It's currently set to Australia by default, but you can drag it around with your mouse to find whatever location you want. And if it doesn't work for you, drop me an email and I can put in a pin for you. And also, feel free to donate via PayPal through the links on the website. Music on today's show comes courtesy of Podsafe Audio, and you can find the podcast by doing a search within iTunes or by subscribing manually by clicking one of the links on the website. Please leave comments and vote for the podcast in iTunes and Podcast Alley. Join me next week where I interview Michael Feller, who did some research into a very volatile topic, the Nazis, their origins, and modern neo-Nazism. One of the surprising things from his research is some of the locations where this right-wing neo-Nazism seems to be popping up. But listen in next week for the interview. I'll leave you with a quote from Carl Sagan. Who are we? We find that we live on an insignificant planet of a humdrum star, lost in a galaxy tucked away in some forgotten corner of a universe in which there are far more galaxies than people. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? I hope you enjoyed the show. Bye for now.
I'm not as think as I smart, I am. I'm not as think as I smart, I am. I'm not as think as I thought I might be, for that's clear anybody to see. I'm not as think as I smart, I am. I'm not as think as I smart, I am. I'm not as think as I clever I would be, I'm not half as clever as me.